Now, on the drought issues, again, this is legislation the government wants dealt with in Parliament this week. The establishment of this $5 billion Drought Future Fund. The money would come, or at least a lot of it, nearly $4 billion of the $5 billion, would come from what's called the Building Australia Fund. The government has previously tried to scrap this Labor-era fund, which is designed to pay for infrastructure, including in regional areas, infrastructure that's been recommended by the independent Infrastructure Australia. Now, Labor's concern here is that this drought fund will become a pork-barrelling fund for the National Party, and that's why, well, it's raising a number of concerns and pointing out the fact that money won't flow from this new drought fund for another 12 months.
Why is it the proposed drought fund will not deliver a cent until at least next July?
Why won't you support farmers going through the drought, Mr Speaker? How on earth can the Leader of the Opposition, and I will call him the Leader of the Opposition because I'm yet to find something that he doesn't oppose, Mr Speaker.
A pattern emerging there from Scott Morrison. Don't stand with the drought farmers, don't stand for national security, full of opposing views. He's going to keep referring to the oppositionist approach of Anthony Albanese. Here you can see that's going to be the pattern from Scott Morrison. But does Labor make a good point here about the need for this new drought fund? As Anthony Albanese has said at a Bush summit last week, he's prepared to back any further funding for the drought, for the farmers and communities stricken by the drought. Just do it through the normal channels of budget appropriations. Well, Barnaby Joyce is the former Deputy Prime Minister, former Nationals leader and former drought envoy, and he joins me this afternoon. Thanks very much for your time this afternoon. Look, is it clear to you why we need this drought fund, why this way of funding drought measures is preferable to the existing method?
Yes, and I think David Littleproud sort of spelt it out very well. He's saying that, are you going to rely in the future for people to say, oh, we'll just make the appropriation at the budget? Because we know the other side of the political fence is not as keen on regional issues as we are, and therefore what this does is it puts into legislation a security of that $100 million. Now, just to address the slush fund idea, that's not correct. There is actually a body, an independent body that will be have oversight of where this is appointed and how this is appropriated. That was one of the amendments as this drought fund went through the lower house. So that issue's been dealt with. Apart from the Labor Party saying, well, it's something for regional areas, it's unsurprising that droughts are more pronounced in regional areas than they are, say, at Martin Place in Sydney. We have to make sure in regional areas that we get a better bang for our buck. I was just having a look at the National Health and Medical Research funding, of which 2.4% across our nation goes to regional areas. So I'm not going to hear a bar of this idea that any time a regional area gets something, it's somehow pork barrelling, but when it goes to the capital cities, it's just good government.
Well, if the concern, though, is that a future government, this locks it in and prevents a future government unscrambling it and denying the funds for the drought-stricken communities.
Well, you can never
Isn't it true that future governments can still get rid of funds? I mean, the government right now is trying to get rid of the Building Australia Fund.
Well, the Building Australian Fund, in dealing with those two issues in seriatim, basically the first one is, of course, a future government can do whatever it likes. No former government can hold a future government to what it wishes to do, but what it would have to do in the future is have to pass the legislation. So it'd have to have the debate about why it's no longer serious about regional people and how they deal with drought. This fund allows in perpetuity money to access, so I imagine things such as dams and pipelines and greater resilience to drought can be put in place in regional areas. And for me, greater resilience might be a gas pipeline into an area so you can broaden the economic base of some of these regional towns. Now, we're saying we want to decentralise. You're saying you don't want everybody to live in Sydney. Well, we've got to have greater resilience in regional cities. Now, that basically says that if the Labor Party in the future, they want to get rid of it, then I suppose that they'll just legislate it out of existence. Now, in regards to the BAF fund, the Building Australia Fund, we have a $100 billion pipeline over the next 10 years. I think $45 billion of that is in the next 4 years. Joel Fitzgibbon rightly pointed out, it's hard to spend the money that we have already on infrastructure. We need to, but it's difficult. I don't think there's any problems whatsoever in us having money going into infrastructure. It's going in hand over fist.
But Barnaby, Joyce, doesn't that make the point that with infrastructure, you don't need a fund, you're getting on with funding it in the normal way? With drought, can't you just get on and fund all these projects in the normal way?
No, I don't think so, because I'll show you where my fears emanate from, David. At the last election, I don't remember the agricultural policy that was released. I never remember hearing a skerrick about the Labor Party's plans for drought into the future. Now, they were absolutely affirmed of the view they were going to win the election. What scared people was, what was their drought policy? We hear about it now. Their policy is to talk about our policy. They don't have their own policy. And so when you see that there isn't the capacity, there isn't the reality, there isn't the sort of the virtue and the authenticity.
But this drought fund won't provide any money for another 12 months.
Well, and in between that period of time, we continue to build on what we've done, such as the farm household allowance, where I believe over 12,000 people have now had access to it. 7,000 are currently involved with it. Close to $1 billion lent out in concessional loans. Water infrastructure, $50 million to assist in concessional water infrastructure. That's just a few of a myriad of issues. The Drought Communities Program, $1 million to each drought shire, and I hope we get a chance to do that again. Also, water infrastructure projects on a grander scale, a capital injection through things such as Hell's Gate. I hope that turns into the first stages of the Bradfield scheme. These are also vitally important, and that's happening now. This is in addition.
Now, let me turn to a couple of other issues here. Last week, you acknowledged it was wrong to describe the idea of an Indigenous voice as a third chamber. Along the way, you suggested the idea that could give Indigenous Australians a greater voice, but also regional Australians a greater voice. That's changing the way the Senate is made up. At the moment, each state gets 12 senators. You're saying stick with that, but break up the state into 6 regions and 2 senators from each region. So that would mean, I guess, a stronger regional voice to Parliament as much as anything.
And a stronger Indigenous voice. Imagine if what we have now, just briefly, we have the state of Western Australia that has 12 senators, 11 come from Perth and 1 outside. Unsurprisingly, the 1 outside is Indigenous, it's Pat Dodson. South Australia, 11 come from Adelaide and 1 outside. Victoria, 11 come from Melbourne and 1 outside. In New South Wales, 11 come from Sydney and Wollongong and 1 outside. And in Queensland, a decentralised state, that's all right, 9 from the southeast corner and 3 outside. 6 regions per state would mean that in a place such as the Kimberleys or the place such as the Cape or the Western districts of New South Wales and Queensland would most definitely have Indigenous representation. So not only would you have a voice to Parliament, you'd have a voice in Parliament. And if we work with Indigenous leaders and how this works, we have a greater capacity to get what I believe the Senate's supposed to do, represent the geographic spread. Currently in Australia, you have this anomaly where of all the capital cities, about 51,000 square kilometres. My electorate is 66,000 square kilometres, yet they have 63 senators. Imagine if you had 63 senators for the seat of New England. Someone would have to stand up and say, that just doesn't smell right. Well, that's what everyone else says. If you want the demographic intensity, go to the lower house. You get your lower house seats. But for the Senate, we need to have a form of geographic spread. Now, the people who get upset about it, current senators, understand that. So you could have, the parties could work out some grandfathering provision, and this would allow, because I believe it can be done by legislation, doesn't need a referendum. At section 7 of part 2 of the Constitution, it says that this is how the Senate is allocated till the Parliament otherwise decides. Now, that's code for legislation.
Well, if it could be done without a referendum, if you just do it with legislation, is there much support amongst your National Party colleagues for this?
Yes, I believe the National Party see this as a very good proposition, and we're building on it, and I'm working with my colleagues to make sure we advance this, as I'm working with Indigenous leaders to advance this as well, because I acknowledge that I was wrong with the third chamber. I can't prove that there's a third chamber, and when you can't prove it, there's not one there. And I think that they're encouraged, the ones I've spoken to, are encouraged by the idea of not only having a voice to Parliament, but a greater voice in Parliament, in the Senate. And certainly the people in the Cape, and I intend to go to North Queensland this weekend and have further discussions with Noel Pearson and sort of run the ideas to show respect to him, and had a discussion with Warren Mundine the other day, and obviously Indigenous people, my own electorate.
And look, Noel Pearson's view is pretty clear on this. I mean, I take what you're saying about stronger regional representation in the Senate. It wouldn't, I think, as you know, guarantee they would be necessarily Indigenous, even if they are from Cape York or the territory of the Kimberley and so on. But putting that to one side, what do you think about the idea of an Indigenous voice, some sort of advisory body, not a third chamber, but some sort of advisory body? Do you have a problem with it?
Well, I'm going to listen to what Noel has to say, and I'll listen respectfully and in a manner that really wants to advance on this issue, wants to advance on Indigenous recognition. I'm not going down this path of, I know it's regional representation, but it is Indigenous representation, and I would be absolutely flummoxed if an area such as the Kimberley or the far north of Western Australia or the Cape didn't have Indigenous regional senators. One would have to suggest that anybody else who did get in would have to be so far across Indigenous issues as to get a vote that they would be a very able representative down here. But overwhelmingly, they would be Indigenous people.
A couple of others. Dean Smith, the Liberal senator, has joined calls for an increase in the New Start allowance. You're on the record as backing this as well. Is momentum building within the government? Well,
look, I just look at once more, and I suppose I wrote a book about this, Weatherboard 9. If you go to a regional town, let's say you take a single mother. A single mother, it's hard to get, in a drought, in a regional town, it's hard to get work to start off with. Even at $300 a week, her rent will probably be around $300 a week. I mean, you've got to ask the real question. It's the New Start, it's not supposed to be there to cruel people, it's supposed to be there to help people, and it gets to a low level where it starts to be ineffectual. And the only way people get around that, for me, is they do cash jobs on the side, cut firewood. Unfortunately, it can go down other avenues of cash jobs, such as, unfortunately, whether it's drug dealing or theft or something like that. That's very minor proportion. But, you know, people who are desperate have to do desperate things. And when you're in a regional place where maybe your fuel bill's $50, $50 a week, and you're only getting $300 a week, and your rent's, $250, $300 a week, you can't make ends meet. And power, how are you going to pay a power bill? I mean, we have to assist these people to get to work, because work is the best alternative. But we've got to be a realist on exactly what the predicament is of people, especially in remote regional areas, and how on earth they get by.
Look, final one. The Senate's just voted to refer the Julie Bishop and Christopher Pyne post-parliamentary jobs to a Senate inquiry. The head of the PM's department said no breach of the code of conduct. What do you think? Does it pass the pub test?
Well, it's been investigated and has passed the investigation. I understand people's concerns on this issue. The ministerial standard does clearly state that once you're no longer a minister, there's got to be a period of grace before you take a job pertinent to your former ministerial duties. And, I could see this was going to be an issue, and obviously has turned into a bit of an issue. And I hope it's cleared, and I hope we can move on. But I can clearly understand that there are people out there with concerns. It'd be foolish to say otherwise. And maybe we can clear the air on this and it'll get out of the way.
So the inquiry is probably not a bad idea to do that. You're not sure if the Parkinson Review has done that just yet?
Well, I think that the Parkinson Review clearly showed they had nothing to answer for. Obviously, that's their view. Maybe the recommendations from the Senate inquiry will give deliberation to how in the future this can be set in more clearer terms, if nothing else.
That'd be a good idea, to have clearer rules around what you can do after being a minister?
I think that you have to take into account the connections you have, and that you're not profiting from the connections you have whilst you're a minister, and to have special information that others wouldn't have, and to use that to the commercial advantage of a certain organisation over preference to another organisation. That's where people's concerns lie, because you know how contracts are made, you know where the costings are, you've been privy to secret information, and that's why people say, well, that could be a distinct commercial advantage to one player over another player. And after a period of time, your general knowledge in the industry, quite all right to take that to a job, but your particular knowledge about pertinent issues of certain contracts, you've got to allow time for that to pass by.
Barnaby, Joyce, we've got to go. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate it.